This video was produced for Newcastle Disability Forum's No Steps History Walks project, funded by the People's Health Trust using money raised by the Health Lottery, North East and Cumbria. The fog on the Tyne famously belongs to the Geordie rhythm combo Lindisfarne, but the bridges over the Tyne are there for all to use, and there's been a Tyne Bridge in some form or another for nearly 2,000 years. The first Tyne Bridge was built by the Romans, roughly on the site of the present Swing Bridge, of which more later. Called Pons Aelius, the Roman structure was named after the Emperor Hadrian, whose family name was Aelius. It was in fact the only Roman bridge outside the city itself named after an emperor, quite an accolade for Tyneside. Hadrian might have personally chosen the location, as he was a famously hands-on sort of emperor, and was in Britannia, the Roman province, to check out the frontier and decide on the position of his famous wall. Pons Aelius was also the name of a fort and settlement of around 2,000 people, mostly military. Now this Roman bridge, according to archaeologists, consisted of a series of stone piers, with a wooden structure providing a roadway. We know this not because we have written records about it or much in the way of evidence, just some remains of wood and stone found on the site by archaeologists. But we also know that the Romans used standardized designs for everything, so the Tyne Bridge would simply be a variation on all the others. The Pons Aelius marked the end of the Roman wall, more or less, and was completed around 120 AD. What I find amazing about it is that it lasted until the Middle Ages. There's no record of its being replaced. Remember that it would be fairly easy to keep renewing the wooden trackway so long as the stone piers remained intact. We can't be sure if the Anglo-Saxons kept using the Roman bridge, but it would make sense. Anyway, what we can be sure of is that a Tyne bridge on that site was destroyed by fire around 1248 AD. A new medieval bridge was finished in the year 1270, possibly using some of the original Roman piers. This bridge had 12 stone arches and wasn't just a crossing. It bore houses, a gatehouse and a portcullis, a chapel, several shops and a prison. All very nice, but it was a costly bridge to keep up. This problem was exacerbated by the fact that part of the bridge came under the control of the Prince Bishops of Durham, and the rest was the responsibility of the burghers of Newcastle. There were endless disputes. Of the 12 arches, the bishop had the upkeep of 6 and the city of Newcastle just 4, a total of 10, out of 12 arches in total. You see the problem. In a way, it's surprising that the bridge lasted as long as it did, but by the 18th century it was looking distinctly dodgy. In 1770 some repairs were carried out after the alarm was raised by a proper inspection report, but it was too little, too late. In 1771, 3 days of heavy rain led to floods that carried away great chunks of masonry. On Sunday, November the 17th, the middle arch collapsed, followed by 2 more. There was no fixing it now. A new bridge had to be built. After a temporary structure was put up for a few years, a new Georgian Bridge was opened in 1781. This had 9 low arches and was solid enough. Unfortunately, it proved to be a major problem as the Industrial Revolution advanced. As shipbuilding took off and ships got bigger, the bridge impeded the local economy instead of helping it. The famous keelboats had a field day, carrying cargo from upriver to sea-going vessels below the bridge. So at least we got a nice song out of it. In 1849, the death knell of the old Georgian Bridge was sounded by the opening of the High Level Bridge. This was designed by Robert Stephenson, son of George, one of the great railway engineers. It took 3 years to build. Stephenson's design consists of 6 ribbed arches supported by stone piers. It's a 2-decker with trains running on the upper deck and pedestrians and road vehicles below. The lower deck is suspended from the arches by wrought iron rods. It was opened by Queen Victoria in 1849, though there was no ceremony. The royal train simply stopped for a short while on the bridge. Like the Georgian Bridge, the high-level crossing was a toll bridge. Tolls were in fact only abolished in 1937. The last horse-drawn omnibus crossed the river in 1931. Modern road traffic has of course taken its toll on Stephenson's design, and after extensive restoration completed in 2008, motor vehicles are restricted to buses and taxis. The old low-level bridges days were, as I said, numbered, and in 1850 the Tyne Improvement Commission was formed, in part to replace it. The stone bridge was dismantled in the mid-1850s and a temporary wooden crossing put in its place. At the same time, various designs were submitted for a bridge that would let people cross as before, but not impede shipping. The Commission's design for the swing bridge became iconic, consisting of a rotating structure powered by steam hydraulics supplied by the Armstrong Works at Elswick. Completed in 1876, the swing bridge opened for the first time on the 17th of July to allow an Italian warship, the Europa, to get upriver to the Elswick Works. The swing bridge boosted river traffic and helped supercharge shipbuilding and engineering on the Tyne. It did have some drawbacks, however. In hot weather, the metal expanded and jammed the bridge, so firefighters had to be called to cool it down by dousing it with water. The solution was a coating of special heat-reflecting paint. The bridge did its most swinging in 1924, when it opened 6,000 times. By the 1970s, 3,000 swings a year were average. The bridge is still swinging, but at a much lower rate. Well, we all have to slow down eventually. Okay, enough about bridges for now. What about the people who used them? More precisely, what about the famous people who visited Tyneside in the dim and distant past? The first household name, sort of, associated with Tyneside is William Wallace, but sadly he only visited in part, and after he was dead. The famous Scottish rebel, as depicted in the film Braveheart, suffered a very nasty fate at the hands of King Edward I. Bits of Wallace were sent to the various parts of the kingdom to discourage other would-be heroes. Suffice to say that his right leg was put on display on the medieval Tyne Bridge in 1298, along with what were described as unmentioned parts of his anatomy in Newcastle Keep. This really set the trend for the next few centuries, with extreme violence characterising a lot of interaction between Tyneside and everybody else. However, after the English Civil War, things calmed down a bit, and in the early 1700s, a very interesting chap indeed came to spy on the Geordies. Yes, I said spy. But this chap was not a foreign agent. No, he was very much in the employ of the English, specifically English, not British, government. His name was Daniel Defoe. Defoe, whose dates are 1660 to 1731, is best known today as the author of Robinson Crusoe. But when he first arrived on Tyneside in 1705, he called himself Alexander Goldsmith, and he had a mission to gauge local opinion on the union of England and Scotland. He sent secret messages back to London, probably via a bookseller whose shop was on the old Tyne Bridge, a chap called Joseph Button. Defoe and Button collaborated on an early newspaper, the Newcastle Gazette, which put out pro-government propaganda. Defoe became very familiar with the area, and he was back in 1610 on the same task, this time going by the name of Claude Guillot, although whether he put on a French accent we don't know. What we do know is that it was during this period that Defoe wrote his famous novel. It seems likely that he did indeed complete at least part of Robinson Crusoe here, possibly when staying in Gateshead. A few years later, after his spying days were over, Defoe wrote a very successful travel book about his journeys throughout the whole of the island of Great Britain. He describes riding his horse over the Tyne Bridge and how impressed he was by the quayside, which he noted were the longest in England, apart from Yarmouth. He added that, "They build ships here to perfection, I mean as to strength and firmness, and to bear the sea." Defoe was clearly quite taken with Newcastle. The same can be said for our second historical celebrity, the preacher John Wesley, founder of Methodism. Wesley, whose dates are 1703 to 91, was originally a Church of England parish priest who became frustrated with the pettiness of parish life. He felt the church had grown stodgy and out of touch with ordinary people, and set out to travel the length of England to preach the word of God, much to the annoyance of his bishop. Wesley arrived in Newcastle in 1742, and later wrote that he was immediately struck by the drunkenness of the foul-mouthed inhabitants. Swearing, he noted, came even from the mouths of little children. But, he hastily adds, he soon found the Geordies were warm-hearted and welcoming to a stranger who insisted on preaching at them. When he preached at Sandgate in March 1742, he was almost trampled underfoot by the enthusiastic crowd. In 1745, Wesley was staying at the Orphan House in Northumberland Street when Bonnie Prince Charlie's rebellion began. Wesley's lodgings were outside the city walls, but he decided to stay put, expressing the view that the Lord would protect him, and so would the 200 cannons that the Hanoverian army had positioned in his immediate vicinity. John Wesley later fell seriously ill in Newcastle and was nursed back to health by Grace Murray, a sailor's widow. The preacher badly misjudged the situation and formed the impression that Grace wanted to marry him. He seems to have bungled his proposal because Grace ended up wedded to another man. A lovelorn Wesley went back to London and, on the rebound, married a different widow, one who made his life miserable for the next 30 years. The Lord clearly doesn't always look after his own. Despite this, Wesley never had a bad word to say about the Northeast in later life. This is his verdict on Tyneside, written in 1759. "Certainly, if I did not believe there was another world, I would spend all my summers here, as I know no place in Great Britain comparable to it for pleasantness." Our final historical visitor is much less well known, but worth knowing about. Harriet Martineau was a Victorian celebrity. Her dates are 1802 to 76, and she was a writer and social reformer who helped found what we now call sociology. Harriet Martineau arrived in Newcastle by ship from Scotland in 1838 and was mobbed by locals. She was an advocate of votes and education for women, radical views in those days, and she was a close friend and ally of Charles Dickens, who called her Hanny. However, Harriet had a problem. She suffered from one of those mysterious maladies that left many Victorian ladies lying prone on a couch, devoid of energy and liable to sudden swooning. She often visited Newcastle to see her brother-in-law, a famous doctor called Thomas Michael Greenhow. She stayed at number 28 Eldon Square for 6 months, before moving to Tynemouth to take the sea air for the next 5 years. Eventually, she was successfully treated by hypnosis, or mesmerism, as it was then called. During her invalid period, Harriet Martineau also experimented with spiritualism. After her initial popularity, Harriet became widely regarded as a crank. Even her old friend Dickens turned against her. In his novel Bleak House, he based the character of Mrs. Jellyby on Harriet, a woman perpetually writing letters to save money for worthy causes, while her own household goes to rack and ruin. Dickens was a massive hypocrite, of course, as he just dumped his own wife for a young actress. But Harriet's reputation went into a nosedive, and she is almost forgotten today, which is a pity. This is a woman whose writing was so lively and popular that the young Princess Victoria invited Harriet to her coronation, and it was no mean feat for any woman to make a living by her pen in those days. Well, that's all from this little talk. I hope you enjoyed it, and that you'll join me next time for more history and more biography as I look at the further history of the Tyne bridges and the people who walked, drove, or steamed across them.